a single metal tube that can knock out a tank in seconds. That idea has shaped modern warfare for almost a century, and today we are going deep into the shoulder-fired weapons that changed the battlefield forever. From cheap disposable tubes to guided missiles that think for themselves, stick around because some of these stories are wild. We start with RPG-7. The Soviet Union adopted it in 1961, and it went on to become the most manufactured anti-tank weapon in history, copied and produced in dozens of countries from Egypt to China to Iran. The launch tube itself is only 40 millimeters wide, but the warhead that comes flying out is 85 millimeters in diameter, much bigger than the tube it launched from, because it is the rear section of the projectile that sits inside the barrel while the warhead sticks out the front. The initial propellant just pushes the projectile a few meters clear of the tube, and only then does the rocket motor on the projectile itself ignite, which is why there is almost no recoil. Effective range against moving targets sits around 200 to 300 meters, though stationary targets can be engaged much further out depending on the ammunition. Over the decades, larger and heavier warheads appeared, including dual-charge versions, where a small first charge detonates reactive armor before the main charge punches through the hull. It earned its legendary status simply by being cheap, simple, and everywhere, but next is the Bazooka M1. Its name actually comes from a homemade musical instrument, a metal tube that the American comedian Bob Burns played on the radio in the 1930s, and the name stuck because of how similar the launch tube looked. The United States developed it in early 1942 with a caliber of 2.36 inches. It used electrical ignition through an internal battery that frequently failed in cold weather, and rockets that burned incompletely inside the chamber exposed the operator to propellant gases, which was a serious problem that pushed development toward better versions. It worked well against early war armored vehicles, but lost its edge as Germany thickened the frontal armor on tanks like the Tiger and the Panther, since the original warhead simply did not have enough charge to punch through steel that thick head-on. That forced the rushed development of the M9 version, and later the so-called Super Bazooka M20 at 3.5 inches in diameter, which was already in service during the Korean War, with a far more capable warhead. The weapon gave its name to an entire category of portable rocket launchers, and people still call almost any shoulder-fired launcher a bazooka today, even when it is a completely different design. Then there is the M79 Thumper, a break-action shotgun-style weapon, except instead of firing buckshot it fires a full 40-millimeter grenade. The United States adopted it in the early 1960s as a standalone weapon with its own stock and sights, not something slung under a rifle. The nickname Thumper, or sometimes Blooper, came from the low, muffled thump sound of every shot, very different from the sharp crack of a rifle. It became an extremely common sight in Vietnam, where the ability to lob an explosive grenade out to 350 meters gave the infantry squad an area effect capability that no rifle or machine gun could match. It could also fire smoke rounds, illumination rounds, tear gas, and even a buckshot-style round for close combat, functioning almost like a very large 12-gauge shotgun. Afterward, the M203 launcher was introduced to mount under the M16A1 rifle, specifically so soldiers could carry a rifle and a grenade launcher in one package instead of two separate weapons. The Mark 19 takes this concept and scales it way up. Think of it as an M2 Browning machine gun, except it fires grenades instead of bullets. The United States began development in the late 1960s, but the reliable, widely adopted Mark 19 Mod 3 only entered service in 1983. It is belt-fed, using a larger and more powerful 40mm cartridge than the M79 or M203, with a much higher muzzle velocity that extends its range out to 2 kilometers, although the average practical engagement range sits closer to 1.5 kilometers. Its rate of fire runs between 300 and 375 rounds per minute. Because of the weight and recoil, it is a crew-served weapon, mounted on a tripod or a vehicle rather than carried and fired like a rifle. Built to saturate an area with fragmentation, it remains in active use today on armored vehicles and fixed defensive positions. The Milker MGL takes a completely different approach, using a revolving cylinder, essentially a giant 40mm revolver. South Africa developed it in the 1980s, with 6 chambers in the drum, manually operated in double action, the drum pretensioned by a spring before use. Each trigger pull rotates the next chamber into place, giving 6 shots before a reload is needed, which completely changes the pace of combat in urban environments where multiple targets can appear in rapid succession. American Special Forces adopted it under the designation M32, and dozens of other countries followed. It is also popular in riot control roles since it can fire rubber rounds and gas. To maximize range, the stock is adjustable not just in length but also in angle, letting the operator fire comfortably while tilted upward. Germany's Panzerfaust is one of the more remarkable stories on this list. It was a disposable, single-use tube with no traditional recoil system at all, the propellant gas simply venting out the open rear of the tube to push the warhead forward without pushing the shooter backward, a principle known as recoilless. Germany developed it across several successive versions during World War II, each one numbered by its effective range in meters. It was simple, cheap, and produced in massive volumes, which made it possible to arm even minimally trained troops, including the hastily assembled Volkssturm militia near the end of the war. The shaped charge warhead could penetrate impressive amounts of armor for its time, and the weapon was responsible for a disproportionate number of Allied and Soviet armored vehicle losses in the final years of the war, precisely because it was so cheap to mass produce compared to a conventional anti-tank gun. Its range was under 100 meters, though, which put the operator in a genuinely dangerous position every time it was used. Its simple, low-cost design directly influenced the later development of the RPG-2, which eventually evolved into the RPG-7 we started with. The M72 law, short for light anti-armor weapon, is a telescoping tube that extends to double its length when ready to fire, and once fired, the entire tube is discarded since it cannot be reloaded. The United States developed it in 1963 with a 66mm caliber, directly replacing the bazooka as the individual infantry anti-tank weapon. It became extremely common in Vietnam, light enough that any soldier could carry it without a major impact on their equipment load, a sharp contrast to the heavy, reloadable bazooka that often needed a two-man team. This single-use, disposable, telescoping concept influenced nearly every light anti-tank launcher that came after it, including the Swedish AT-4, that still fills the same role in American forces today. Sweden's Carl Gustaf stands apart because it is reusable, not disposable like most weapons on this list. After firing, the shooter manually reloads it through a break-open breech, much like a giant shotgun. Sweden developed it in 1948 with an 84mm caliber, the same as the AT-4, and remarkably, it is still in production and active use nearly 80 years later, a rare kind of longevity in this category of equipment. Its versatility is what kept it relevant, since it can fire shape charge anti-tank rounds, conventional high-explosive rounds against personnel and structures, plus smoke and illumination rounds, all from a single tube that would normally require several separate weapons. The most recent version, the M4, is considerably lighter than older models and remains in service with the United States, Sweden, and dozens of other armies as a multi-purpose squad subweapon rather than a pure anti-tank tool. The FGM-148 Javelin represents a completely different generation of technology, a guided missile where the operator no longer needs to aim after pulling the trigger. It is a fire-and-forget system, meaning the missile's infrared seeker locks onto the target before launch and tracks it independently afterward. The United States developed it in the 1990s, replacing the older Dragon missile system, which had required the shooter to keep the target in the crosshairs the entire time until impact, exposing him for far too long given how slow that missile was. Instead of flying straight at its target, the Javelin climbs, flies over the vehicle, and dives down first at the final moment, striking the roof of the armored vehicle, which is historically much thinner than the frontal armor since older armor designs rarely anticipated an attack from above. Combined with a dual-charge warhead designed to defeat explosive reactive armor, this made the Javelin extremely effective against modern Russian armor during the conflict in Ukraine, which brought the weapon a level of worldwide fame far beyond the specialized military world. China's QLU-11, about after Chinese designers concluded that the Soviet-style 30mm grenades they had been using lacked firepower, while NATO's 40mm grenades lacked portability, leading to opt a 35mm round for all their launchers instead. The QLU-11 can be fitted with a free-floating barrel, an advanced fire control system with a laser rangefinder, thermal imaging, and a ballistic computer that gives it airburst capability, along with removable drum magazines holding anywhere from 3 to 15 rounds. That said, this design has never been proven in actual combat, and everything known about it comes only from what the Chinese government has chosen to share, which says a lot about how much confidence to place in those claims. The Soviet GPP-25 Kostyur hangs under the barrel of an AK rifle. But unlike the American M203, it loads from the muzzle rather than the breech. The 40mm round goes in from the front of the tube with no casing at all, and the standard grenade, the VG-25, simply drops straight into the tube. It gave Soviet and later Russian soldiers the same rifle and grenade launcher combination the M203 gave American forces, all without needing separate weapons. It remains in active service with Russian forces and in dozens of countries that operate the AK as their standard rifle, and it later spawned lighter, updated versions like the GP30 and GP34. We will close with what might be the most unusual weapon on this entire list, the M202 Flash. Instead of one barrel, it joins 4 launch tubes into a single weapon, and instead of conventional anti-tank warheads, it fires incendiary rockets. The United States developed and used it toward the end of the Vietnam War, with a 66mm caliber. Each rocket carries a thickened incendiary agent similar in concept to napalm, sticking to whatever surface it hits and burning for an extended period, but with one key difference: the M202's agent is pyrophoric, meaning it ignites spontaneously on contact with air, while napalm needs an external ignition source. Its 4-tube design set it apart from almost every other shoulder-fired launcher, which typically fire one projectile at a time, allowing 4 shots in rapid succession without manually swapping ammunition. It saw only limited use, mostly against fortified positions and bunkers where prolonged burning was more valuable than pinpoint armor penetration. It gained a strange kind of fame from the 1985 film Commando, where Arnold Schwarzenegger appears on the cover holding one. But because the weapon was bulky and the ammunition was especially reliable, it never went much further than that. From a cheap tube to arm untrained militia in the final days of World War II, to a missile that can think for itself and pick the weakest point on a modern tank, this entire category of weapons tells the story of how necessity and engineering have constantly reshaped the battlefield. If you enjoyed this breakdown, drop a like and subscribe, because there is a lot more military history coming your way.